How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, great discussion we're going to have today. It's about inmate unity. The biggest threat to safety and security is inmate unity. That's why it's very important for us as management, for us as frontline, to make sure we are doing what we can to make sure the inmates don't unite in a cause that can wind up threatening the safety and security of our facility. And it's not even just about unity. It's also about, do they feel justified and why they're uniting? And we're going to cover 6 concerns that can help us prevent the inmates from uniting in an effort to violate our operations, our safety and security. And my guest today is going to be James Ferreira, aka Butch, retired Deputy Commissioner out of Massachusetts Department of Corrections. But real quick, I'd like to go over our sponsors. We have American Military University. Guys, if you're looking to go back to school and seek that degree, get that education, please check out American Military University. They're very supportive of what we do in corrections, also very supportive of what we do here on Tier Talk. And we also have Guardian RFID. From inmate tracking and cell checks to cloud-based business and artificial intelligence, Guardian RFID digitally transforms jails, prisons, and juvenile detention facilities of every size. Visit GuardianRFID.com for more information. And guys, Thin Gray Line Media, www.thingraylinemedia. They are publishing my next book as we speak. It should be out in a couple of weeks. Lessons learned while working in a prison. My journey from officer to administration. There's about 156 tips in there. And what it's going to do, it's going to help you take your correctional career to the next level. I wish it was advice that I had when I was going in. But again, it's a work of passion, and it should be out hopefully in a couple of weeks. It's a hardcover book, and it's about 500 something pages, but it's also a bit of a journal. So you could write your notes next to each passage, and eventually when you decide to move on past the career, you could pass it off. That's the key. And don't forget, guys, I do have Inmate Manipulation Decoded already on the market. Link to that is in the description. All right, Butch, what's up, man?
Anthony, how are you, sir?
Good, brother. You mind introducing yourself again to our audience?
Butch Ferreira, former Assistant Deputy Commissioner for the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, in which I worked for 35 years, 9 months. Started as a correction officer, and the day I retired, I left the department as the Assistant Deputy Commissioner.
And now you're back.
With me. I am. My mind is all the way back, thanks to you.
Makes me feel good about that. Thank you.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate that. So, real quick, it's going to be a needed discussion. I think the biggest threat to our facility is when inmates unite. So I want to go over 6 concerns that can cause inmate unity. Now, guys, mind you, when we're talking about these concerns, these are concerns that we need to address and not ignore. You know, inmate unity is a lot different than advocating for a concern. It's okay if an inmate feels that they need something and they're going to advocate for that. I get that. My biggest concern is when they decide to unite and they pose a threat to the facility. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over 6 concerns that will motivate inmates to unite and possibly cause a threat to the facility in regards to our operational effectiveness. So the first thing I would like to do, which I think matters right off the bat, because guys, there's ways when we're going to know about the concerns that the inmates have. And the last thing that you want to do is ignore those concerns, ignore those grievances, ignore the remedies. Now, guys, mind you, guys, inmates now, they live in dorm settings now. So think about that, guys. They're more open. They're able to connect. They're able to communicate. Officers that walk these dorms, I mean, they're severely outnumbered. If the inmates unite, it's even worse. Because right now, like if I have a concern, I'm walking down a door, maybe let's say with me with a few inmates. But if we have a concern that could affect the population as a whole, like a collective concern, then it's one officer versus all those inmates, or 2 officers versus all those inmates if we're lucky. So having said that, guys, one thing we want to do is make sure that we're reading those grievances and checking out for trends that could affect the inmate population as a whole. And if the inmates feel that their grievances aren't being properly attended to, if they're not being properly heard, then they will take it up a notch. So the grievance system is a great warning for us, especially as management, if we start to see trends and these concerns where, okay, we had a concern in this unit. Oh, now we have that same concern in another unit. So having said that, If you start ignoring the grievances, if you start ignoring the remedies that they're putting in, which is their route to take when they have a concern, that is their professional route, if you will. If you start ignoring that route, then they start to look at maybe taking measures into their own hands. And 9 times out of 10, guys, when you have riots or when you have some form of inmate uprising, the first thing management always does is go back to the grievance system, go back to the remedy system, and see if they could have caught something that was trending that was overlooked. What's your thoughts on that, Butch? Am I correct? Is that the first thing you look at?
Very good points, Anthony. One of the things that in facilities, larger facilities, I should say, from the medium security up, there's probably a single person who's dedicated to monitor inmate grievances. What I'm traditionally used to calling that person is the grievance officer. And that grievance officer has a very important role to accept all the grievances, review all the grievances, do the background, investigate the grievances, come up with a finding, identify some facts, and then respond to the inmates in writing. He or she is also responsible to manage that program. Hopefully, in the overall security program at the facility, they have a reporting structure where, whether it's twice a month or once a month, they actually report all out on and track grievances. How many did we have? What categories of grievances were they? How many were approved? How many were denied? The ones that were approved, what were the outcomes? It's a very complex system and thorough, and that's why it's important. It's so important that we dedicate a 40-hour-a-week employee to that post to make sure that we have a good,
Good eyes on it.
A good feel of the climate of the facility.
Yeah, we would call them jpeg coordinators. I mean, you want to give the inmates a way to showcase their concerns, where also the integrity of the concerns are protected. So, as I said, usually the jpeg coordinator is someone that is not involved directly with the departments. So she is seen, or he is seen, as more objective.
Yes.
Yeah, and then it gives it directly over to administration, who is able to look at that concern from a facility level. Now, mind you, guys, remedies could also go outside the facility. It can go to the abuts person. It can go to the internal affairs department, whatever it is. But there's got to be a route sometimes where they're able to jump over the person that is the concern, or jump over the entity that is the concern. And again, if you're not taking those into account, those grievances, the problem is you could be missing out on some good intel that could protect your facility. Now, mind you, it's also something that's highly misused by the inmate population. 9 times out of 10, most of the grievances are very selfish in nature, not so much about the needs of the facility or the needs of the inmates as a whole, but most of the grievances are more about individualized wants. And having said that, you need to be able to recognize the difference of what is a want that's truly affecting this inmate, or as opposed to what is a need that's affecting the inmate population as a whole. You really need to know that difference, because, again, usually if an inmate has a personalized want, 9 times out of 10, it's not going to affect every other inmate in that cause. But if an inmate does have a need that could affect the other inmates, that's going to be an issue. I'll give you an example of one. Bad food. If there's an inmate that starts complaining that, I don't know, the milk coming out of the dining room is spoiled, it's like, okay, well, that's one milk. Okay, but now you got another inmate complaining that their milk is spoiled, and then another one's complaining that their milk is spoiled. You better get on it, because inmates will unite over bad food. I mean, it's just that simple. So again, look for things that affect the population as a whole when you're reading those grievances. Anything that can go past the want of that personal inmate. If that want of that personal inmate, if that inmate's making a complaint and that want can become a need to the other inmates, then you better start looking at that to make sure that's not a trend, so we can get ahead of it. And again, the grievance system, the remedy system, whatever it is, definitely something you want to keep your eyes on, pay attention to. And that's at all levels, all departments, because there's a lot of information being given at that time. And I know, as I said, it is kind of misused a lot, but having said that, this can actually be a very valued valuable tool when it comes to getting the intel you need to properly run a facility and be preventive before shit hits the fan. Any other thoughts on that about the grievance system or the remedy system, Butch, from your perspective?
Some facilities have informal grievance process before they actually have a formal process where they're encouraged to go. For example, if the grievance was related to some type of inmate property or something of that nature, where they're encouraged to go to the property officer, have access to the property officer, and try to clean it up that way. Also, there are some topics that aren't that have their own separate grievance system. For example, and many agencies will eliminate or remove the medical piece from the inmate grievance system, and the medical people will have their own grievance process too. So there's a little bit of distinction there between the institutional grievance process and the medical grievance process. You'll have a medical professional answering medical grievances as opposed to a correctional practitioner per se.
Now, mind you, still, you're right, 100%. Medical, dental, mental health, those are issues that if the inmate does grieve, it should go directly to the department. But if by chance those inmates feel that they've exhausted measures with medical, they can always come back to the administrative side and say, hey, listen, medical's not responding to these concerns. And then it kind of puts us right back into the mix again. But you're right, medical, mental health,
sure does.
Dental.
One of the things I just wanted to mention too, before we move on from grievances, is a good grievance process or a grievance system that meets national standards has an appeal process too. So if the inmate doesn't like the outcome, there is a process from him or her to appeal that decision and go to someone higher.
Yeah, and I like what you said. So first off, yeah, right, guys, there's going to be an inquiry. They're going to ask a question. Maybe they get about 15 days before there's a response. If they don't like the response, then it can go up a notch, and then they can go ahead and grieve that response, which takes 30 days to respond in some cases, depending on policy. And then if they don't like that, then they could appeal it, which gets answered at the higher level of that department. And last but not least, if they don't like that and they've exhausted all measures at the institutional level, they still have the appellate division. Now, I like what you said too before. I want to go over one more thing. So, right, when it comes to individualized concerns that are more about maybe personal to one inmate, there usually are unit managers or supervisors on the floor that could really handle those things if it's within their area of control or area of expected control, whatever it is. So again, you have maybe something that's affecting a housing unit, but maybe on a very small scale. You would tell the inmate, hey, did you go see your unit supervisor? Have you tried these measures first? Because you have to be very careful with the grievance system too, because if you're at the higher level and you're entertaining things that are at the lower level, the problem is the lower level won't be able to run the ship, because no matter what happens, the inmate's able to bring it to a higher level. So it's incumbent on us on the highest of levels to see what it is that we could always push down to make sure that all those measures are exhausted, so the inmate knows that they can't circumvent the system. And Russ has a great quote in my upcoming book. The best gift a supervisor can give their front line is final authority. So that kind of exactly what it is that you want to push down. So again, grievance system can be misused in an effort for an inmate to circumvent. So you make sure that you want to do whatever you can for the things that you can handle. I get it. But for things that really should be left to front line, let them lead the way.
Right. Yeah, a good grievance officer will kick those grievances back to make sure that the informal process is used first. Especially, he or she will know the difference between, a legitimate individual personal grievance as opposed to a grievance which could have a more of a detrimental result if they don't get right on it. But I think it's important to count your grievances, whether it be monthly, and understand what category of grievances you're getting. There's one other to help with the informal process. Many agencies now have what they call management access periods, or some type of event during the week where inmates leaving the chow hall or some other areas can have like a quick one-on-one with many of the administrators and folks that have special jobs like the property officer, the grievance officer, canteen services, so on and so forth. And as a warden or a deputy warden, you can watch those management access periods and see, for example, if your property officer has 40 inmates in line wanting to see him, you got a pretty good indication that there's some issues with property. But when it runs well, when people are doing their job and giving the inmates what they got coming to them, no more, no less, you'll see those management access periods are pretty, I don't want to say mundane, but they become routine.
Yeah, and you also, I mean, usually they have like these inmate tier reps or inmate liaisons who have been elected by the inmate population to speak on the population's behalf. So it's always good to have monthly meetings with them, because that's another way to try to resolve an issue. And usually when you have the inmate liaisons, that's like, it's better than administration kind of just going down and being, approached by every inmate. It's like, no, you know what? If you have those concerns, bring it up to your tier rep, and then we have a monthly meeting, and we'll go ahead and we'll see what those concerns are. And be mindful, guys, when you have those monthly meetings and you're listening to those inmates, you got to give sometimes those tier reps, those inmate liaisons, if they have concerns that could be affecting the population, you got to sometimes give them a win if you can, because they also have to be seen as effective back to the population. So like if you're constantly shutting them down, the population is going to be like, well, this tier rep thing isn't working, or this inmate liaison thing isn't working. So make sure that when you have a meeting and there is a concern and you say something, stay by your word. If this is because this inmate now is, believe it or not, he's relaying your word back to that unit, back to that population. So some facilities do operate where they have an elected inmate who comes up and speaks for the population in the housing unit. And to be honest with you, with those inmates, not that you want to treat them any differently, but they are speaking with the concerns of that population. So weigh it in. Have your right resources around you to see if these are concerns or not. So usually when you're meeting with those tier reps, you want to have the other department heads with you so you can address it as immediate as you can. And then you give the inmate a win if there's something that is a concern. So again, this is all about communication, intel, and trying to get ahead of what could be trending. Now, we talked about inmate grievances, tier reps, and all this other stuff, guys. Believe it or not, guys, this is a great way to catch stuff that's trending. And this may fall into this part, denial of inmate rights. Believe it or not, it's funny because they all could connect with this, because everything we talk about may have some connection to each other, because even the next thing I'm going to bring up could relate to this. But let's talk about denial of inmate rights. I mean, I've seen riots happen because inmates, they expect these things. They expect good medical, which they should have. They expect good food, which it should be edible. They expect programming, which we should be offering. And all of a sudden, when the facility starts to fall back and they're not given the program, or the food is not as good as it should be, or medical is not up to par because the vendor, whoever they got, is just not doing what's expected of them, all of a sudden these inmates are going to start coming together and they're going to think that they're justified because, hey, these are our rights. You're not giving us our rights. And now what we're going to do is, we tried the grievance system. You've ignored it. At this point here, we want to get attention. So this is the best way we can get attention. And what do they do when they want to get attention? They take control of the facility. Sad to say, but that's one of the ways that they go about to get attention when they feel that they're not getting the attention through the normal channels. But what's your thoughts on denial of inmate rights, Butch?
So, there are a few things in corrections in which you strive to never make mistakes, and you mentioned a few of those. For visits, all of those things that are outlined in statute that are pretty much rights given to inmates. They have a right to a visit. They have a right to be free, unimpeded access to health care. The food issues. They have a right to get a meal that meets certain standards. All of those, they have a right to be free from harm. And so I like the saying you say, Anthony, and believe it. They know their rights. There could be times where you may have to explain some differences between the rights and privileges, but if you're going to start, if there's some changes in the inmate rights, the way they're used to it, you're going to get pushback from the inmate population. Now, changes in some of the inmate rights comes. I can give you a good example of good time. in my 36-year career, the way we had awarded good time and how we granted good time has changed depending on the times and who the governor was. Sometimes they got statutory good time. There was a time when we stopped statutory good time. Earned good time really never changed, but there were different programs at one time that earned good time, and then all of a sudden, we wouldn't take the good time, but that program was no longer designated as a program that granted good time. So those things were touchy. But again, we run the agency and we ran the facility, so we managed those changes. But certainly, if inmates thought that their rights, their God-given rights as an American, were being infringed in any way, you're going to have to deal with that, and you're going to have to manage that.
You're actually touching in on something that is going to cross into the next section, so we might as well just jump in on.
Tried not to do that.
No. It's perfect because, as I said, no, Butch, it's perfect because they all kind of run into each other. So it's good because they're not. You know what's funny, guys? We come up with tips, but none of these tips are isolated. These tips are just, they kind of fluid,
Yeah.
But I want to mention something, guys, just as a reminder, because I said it at the beginning, but I want to say it again. Remember, guys, the prison environment with these dorms and, gangs, because remember, gangs already have a unity. We're in an environment now where it's easy for inmates to unite. That's why a dialogue like this is very important, because it's harder for us to stop inmate unity now because of the way the facilities layouts can be. Again, a lot of our officers are working in open dorms. Now, you mentioned something, it kind of crosses into it, sudden adverse policy changes. Now, mind you, guys, there are certain things that inmates may see as a right that isn't a right. Let's put it right there. I'm going to put it right out there right now. A privilege that we want to take away that they automatically think is a right. And what doesn't help us is when the people on the outside pressure us into making that privilege a right, because what they don't realize is, how do we control inmates? It's a lost first gain system. We don't control inmates by rewarding them for good behavior. We control inmates by taking away things when they commit to bad behavior. And guys, that's the way the system runs. In my experience, that's the best way. We don't run on a reward system. We run on a loss versus gain. Hey, you messed up. We're taking it back. There goes your TV. Now you got to go back and earn it through whatever process you have to go. Now, when it comes to sudden adverse policy changes, I'll give you an example of one that I know of. I remember when we took away cigarettes and tobacco. Now, a lot of people on the outside, they're fucking inmates, just take it away and who cares? You guys run the house. It's not that easy, because you have to be respectful to the people that have to carry that policy out. That would be lazy for me as an administrator or policymaker to say, hey, Butch, I know you work in the floor. Starting today, no more smoking. Now you got this officer that is going to have to go in there and get inmates to comply with that. And there's no introduction to it. There's nothing. And it's going to be very hard for the officer to do that, because the inmates haven't had a chance to voice their concerns against it, or slowly start getting used to the fact that, hey, I'm not going to be able to smoke. Let me just start kicking this habit now. So again, I think the timing of how an adverse policy is going to be implemented, I think the timing matters. Like, okay, hey, we're going to take away smoking in June. It's January. Let's start getting the message out now, and let's start, go ahead and moving forward. Because again, yes, the inmates are going to be pissed off at first, but they can still smoke for a few months. But eventually they start to navigate through. And by the time it's 6 months, you may have a few inmates that are still pissed off, but it's not the bunch, because most of them have said, you know what, it's not worth it. That's my last cigarette. I'm done. And whatever it is. But again, sudden adverse policy changes, if not introduced in a timely manner, can definitely put the people that are implementing it, which are the officers or whoever on the floor, it could put them in serious danger. And again, when it comes to adverse policy, some of the things I'm thinking about are things where inmates think it's been a right because they've had it for so long. But having said that, it's not a right. It was always a privilege. But again, we are going to take it, but we're going to treat it as a right for a few weeks so we can slowly introduce whatever we got to do before we go ahead and take it away. Because again, it's all about the inmate's perspective at first. If I'm going to go ahead, again, smoking, right? Smoking wasn't a right for them. But when it came to the point where we were taking away cigarettes, they wanted it. They thought it was a right. You can't take away my right to smoke. It's my job. It's my body. It's whatever it is. I have a right to smoke if I want to. And it's like, no, you don't. But hold on. If it's a right to you at this point, let's slow it down. And then eventually we'll go ahead and within 6 months or so, hey guys, you're losing the cigarettes, because now you're starting to realize we're going to do it anyway. We're sending out memos. We're sending out reminders. The date has not changed. And at that point here, 6 months, if you haven't complied, the officers are going to be allowed to go ahead and take it and possibly charge you. What's your thoughts on that, Butch?
I think that's very important to strategize, have a plan. Time is always of the essence, whether it's, some of those drastic adverse in which the inmates would consider an adverse policy change are usually, a major event. And usually we have time to get it implemented appropriately. Smoking was a big one in my career. Good time was another one in my career. The changes, how good time was awarded. I thought sometimes with technology now, with inmate mail, a lot of facilities now are no longer accepting post and parcel at the facility. It goes to another site. They copy it and they send it electronically. Some of those things, they have a lot of questions. We have to have time to answer the questions and to get the truth out, so that it doesn't impact the facility climate. But managing the message and controlling the message and the narrative is very, very important. And being sensitive to some of their concerns are legit. So you have to be able to address that stuff.
And remember, guys, in their mind, if they had it for a long time, in their mind, it's a right. So you don't want to just go in there and just take things away. You got to let them know. And again, that's through the introduction of the policy. Then 6 months, guys, it's happening. And it never was a right. It was a privilege. So be prepared for it because it's coming. And then usually it works itself out, at least to some extent. It's a lot better than just doing it. It's a lot better than just doing it.
Anthony, a lot like we talk about with the officers, as much as you can tell them as to what the why we're doing it goes a long way as well. Because with the why for the smoking was very powerful,
Yeah. Cancer.
And it came from the courts.
Yeah.
An inmate brought that to federal court, secondary smoke. And guess what? We were mandated to go no smoking.
Yeah. And as I said, that's great that you mentioned that too, because the why does matter. I mean, some inmates will pick up on it and get it, and then some won't. But right. Having said that, the good part about it is that some inmates have, just accepted it where, if you went right ahead and did it, you wouldn't have those accepted parties. They all would be in resistance. And now the officer that's got to implement that is really at risk, because inmates that usually normally wouldn't be uniting now have a cause, and they also feel justified. So I go to take a cigarette from Butch, and let's say Butch doesn't know Gangi, but Gangi's a smoker too. Gangi's pissed off too. So Gangi and Butch don't get along, but they got a common cause now, and they feel justified in that.
That's correct. I've seen it happen. Yep.
Yeah, the biggest threat I think outside of inmate unity is when inmates feel united, when inmates feel justified in that unity, and that kind of crosses into something else we're going to mention later on. I want to talk about a rogue officer, or what I call collective punishment. I'm not a very big fan of collective punishment. I'm not a big fan, even on the administrative level, doing that to my officers as well. I'm not a big fan of, you have an inmate that does something foolish, or even just as a management perspective, you have an officer that's not up to point, or a staff member that's up to point. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hold everybody else accountable, write some memos that mess up with the other people who are doing their job. And then you get the people that are actually doing their job. They become frustrated. It's like, hey, I'm not involved in this. Why don't you just hold this person accountable? So I've worked with people who may have a problem with one inmate, and what they tend to do is they tend to punish all the inmates based on that one inmate's actions. And the reason why that's bad, for many reasons. First off, you got a rogue officer now, or a rogue staff member who's now uniting all these inmates on this collective punishment inmates that haven't done anything wrong that are now being swept up with the inmate that has. And here's the funny thing: if those inmates don't turn against the officer for like, yo, I didn't do nothing, and then just go after the officer, they're going to go against the inmate that wind up doing something foolish. So again, I don't think it's a good thing for many reasons, because one, you don't want them to go after the staff, but you also don't want them to go after the inmate. You know, and if people are like, well, who cares about the inmate? Well, who's responding to the code? We are. You know what I mean? You know, we're responding to the code, and you know, at the end of the day, collective punishment doesn't work. Just pull the inmate out. I know a scenario where I'll tell you where it was a bad call. I had an inmate that just was loud on the dorm and just totally disrespectful. And the officer was just kind of just getting upset with this one inmate. And it was a third shift. And what happened was the officer's like, you know what, if you're going to continue to be loud, screw it. So he turned on the lights on the dorm. So you have inmate food service workers that have to get up in the morning, medical work, whatever it is. So now all the inmates start rallying up because now, hey, I didn't do nothing. What the hell? I got to get up in the morning. And I'm like, this is not a good idea. I mean, what do you expect? And he goes, oh, they'll police the one. No, it's not our job. Our job is to get that one, charge them, do whatever we got to do, hold them accountable. But the last thing we want is to turn on the lights, wake up the whole unit. And now we just lost the whole unit because you couldn't handle the one, you know, and be honest with you guys, the job of the officer is to hold that inmate accountable, not the other inmates. You know, it's not the job of the officer to tell the other inmates, go hold that inmate accountable. No, that's your job. Don't turn on the lights and expect that all these other inmates are going to get pissed off and now tell that inmate, hey, you got to stop. That's not their inmate's job. That's your job. What's your thoughts on the rogue officers or the collective punishment? And by the way, Butch, rogue officers could also fall into kind of the denial of rights. I have seen officers that either take advantage of just taking away privileges, which guys, gotta be careful with that, because if we get too crazy with that, those privileges will become rights. Or officers that are punitive in their measures, and you know they will go ahead and take away an inmate's rights because they're you know, at that point they're just more concerned about being punitive as opposed to the end result. Because at the end of the day, guys, in corrections right now, it's not just about being punitive, guys. It's what's the end result. You know, if you're going to take this away, what's the chance the inmate can get it back? You have to have a model for corrective behavior outside of punishment. If you don't have a model for corrective behavior outside of punishment, the people on the outside are going to see that's punitive automatically. And then they wind up coming at us for retaliatory actions. What's your thoughts on that? Rogue officers, collective punishment?
So, Anthony, you described an incident that probably happens in every jail, prison, or detention facility in this country on occasion. That's a younger officer, trying to do the right thing and making mistakes, I think. I think, you know, in the scenario in which you described, that may happen once, but the correction officer probably doesn't make that mistake more than once. But, you know, collective punishment, again, I'm going to give you a little different flavor as far as rogue officers and that type of stuff. You should have a system. You know, the management should have a system. And this is going to be twofold. So I want to get out two very important points. If you can track complaints on employees, you know, who's complaining, who has complaints, what are the complaints, and you can address those and see who the officers are with the most complaints and how, you know, what they look like, what kind of complaints are they. And if there's some over a period of time, I think there's going to be some inferences you can make where the officer may need to change his or her approach. Now, having said that, officers very good officers that do their job very well are also going to get a number of frivolous complaints. And if you're not an officer and they're not complaining about you, there's a piece of me as a manager, as a deputy warden and assistant deputy commissioner, you may not be enforcing rules or doing everything the way that you should be doing. Just by the nature of the business, you're going to get complaints. But rogue officers or rogue behavior has to be addressed, has to be tracked, and has to be monitored. And again, it all comes together because you can put in a grievance relative to a correction officer. I was used to a separate system where we would intake inmate complaints about staff. We would try to validate it or substantiate it. We would try to investigate all of them. Obviously, some of them were, unsustained because it was his word against their word, or so on and so forth. But that again, in prisons, we need to manage the climate, and this is all part of it with the rogue officers. Because yes, when officers start to punish as a group, it's going to escalate. There's no de-escalation technique in that at all. But I will tell you that if management decides that there's a certain area of the facility or a certain activity in which there's a lot of activity, bad activity like drugs or contraband or fights, and they stop that activity, that can be looked upon as group punishment, but it also is necessary. So there's different scenarios for each one, but individual officers is certainly needs their performance when it comes to this topic has to be monitored and controlled by the administration.
Yeah, I would notice that if you're reading a grievance and you start getting, let's say, concerns from a certain staff member that goes beyond like just one inmate, it affects every area they're working in. It's like, okay, we do have to talk to this one officer or this one staff member because, this doesn't seem to be an issue between them and this one inmate. Now, the same issue occurred in another area. And at that point there, believe it or not, guys, the inmates doing it the right way are actually giving us the best advice we need, because if we allow it to carry out, there's going to be the inmates going to say, hey, yo, I'm not telling nobody. When this guy comes down the wing, I'm getting him. Like, I'm done. And guys, I'll be honest with you, fire starters, rogue officers, is parts in my book as well. Got to be careful of them too, because the funny thing is I've seen it where shit's about ready to hit the fan because of the stuff that they're doing and they call off. They're not at work. And when the inmates have their plan in motion, it's in motion. So you have a good officer that's been doing their job, but today's your day, man. Sorry about that. I know you've been great to me, but I got a plan in motion. We can't turn back now, because it's not about the rogue officer anymore. It's about the message that they want to get across because the facility failed. So having said that, guys, think about what just happened here. It went from the rogue officer who was being rogue to all of a sudden they went to us. We failed to answer in that response. So now their message gets elevated. So again, it's like, well, you don't have a problem with me. I wasn't the rogue officer. No, we have a problem with the facility and how they handled that rogue officer. So at that point here, this is about the message. And the worst part is they feel justified. And the scary thing about this, guys, is when you have inmate unity, and again, the inmates feel justified, it's very hard for us to maneuver, because it's very hard for us to negotiate with them because they feel justified and they're fighting for a cause. So when someone's fighting for a cause, they're willing to give a lot more to that cause. So again, we don't want to get to a point where not only do the inmates unite, but do they feel justified? And in this case here with the rogue officer, think about it, guys. My problem at one point was with the rogue officer, but you guys failed to do anything about it. So now my problem's with the facility itself. And now we're going to get attention to this facility by acting up and taking some hostages. You mentioned a good one, Butch, and I think this is very important. It's not really talked about much, but I would love to get your thoughts. I'll have you go first on this one. But you mentioned excessive use of force. I mean, let's discuss that a little bit. How does that cause inmates to unite?
So I've seen, I reviewed a ton of use of forces. We had a very strict policy on who needed to review all use of forces within a certain time limit. So I've seen a lot. I've seen my share of force that was determined to be excessive, some egregious, some not so egregious, but it's all about the perception. It's about being professional and control, because if you overstep your boundaries and use force, and not necessarily excessive by policy, but what is determined by the inmate population, they can rally behind that, especially if it's on an inmate that may have been defenseless or restrained, or the situation was probably resolved to the point where it was starting to be de-escalated, and we had some extracurricular activities that took place. I can tell you, just to set the record straight, I've charged officers criminally. I've had state troopers come to the facility and put officers under arrest in cuffs and walked off the property, all the way until the other end, where I've cleared officers of some very severe complaints and allegations as well, because the investigations proved to be that the officer was the allegations were unfounded. So I've seen both spectrums of it, but if you want to use excessive force, or and that's what it's defined, if it's excessive force. I used to, in my mind, call it unfair force. If somebody's restrained and unable to defend himself in some way, and other inmates see it, you're going to hear about it. And they don't really care why it happened either. They just know that it did happen, and that and they're going to band together over excessive use of force.
Yeah, and guys, I want to make sure that we know, especially at the higher level, if you're at the management level and you're listening to this, most of the concerns that we're talking about here, they're bringing it to management's attention because there are things that they're going to want action to. So again, they feel that there's a concern that happened, let's say, in this front line area. So they're going to go ahead and bring it to management, and they are going to expect action. And the sad thing is, if there is something that the facilities have fault with, the action in some cases has to be seen, and it has to be relevant. Sad to say. Only reason why is when these inmates bring up these concerns, like we said, excessive use of force or whatnot, they need to know that we're doing the right thing, and guys, this, I know it's crazy, but having said that, we're meant to manage a facility, and we're meant to custody, care, and provide for these inmates. So if any part of those get violated, management is expecting to step up and do something about it. And in some cases here, guys, there have been times where it has to be seen. Like, hey, these were our actions we took, and this is exactly what we did, because again, if the inmates don't believe that their concerns are being heard, or worse, if they don't believe that they're being addressed when there really is a needed concern, then we haven't really solved anything. Because in the end of the day, you as management, your word has to be good. It has to be good to your staff. It also has to be good to the inmate population. So when they're coming to you and they do have a concern, and they're voicing it to you, and that concern does require an action, and you say, I get to it, and you never do, then they lose trust in you. So eventually what they're going to do is they're going to start taking measures in their own hands. So if you want to even protect your staff, believe it or not, this is still an effort to protect their staff. You have to let the inmates know that if they have a true concern, that you're doing something about it. Because at the end of the day, guys, when the inmates decide that, hey, we're not being heard, and management's not listen to us, we're going to make them listen. Who do you think are the ones that get attacked? Who do you think is the ones that are getting assaulted? It's going to be your front line. So the moment you start turning a blind eye to serious grievances or serious concerns, and the inmates feel that management just doesn't care, then your front line may be, unfortunately, in the middle when they decide to bring matters out there into their own hands and get that attention. And I'm telling you guys, when inmates want immediate attention, they go for those riots. Because when they do a riot, the media jumps on it, because the media knows when inmates riot, they're rioting for something, and they want to know what it is, because they want to point at the flaws in the system. So the media will always jump on a riot. And it's not because they want to help us, and we'll get to that. It's because they want to show where the system has failed, and that's why all these inmates are united. So again, guys, if management fails to listen, you could be putting your front line, in risk. And again, if management also fails to address a concern. And that kind of brings us to the civil arrest in community and social media and public support. I want to kind of touch on something that's part of this first real quick. So when we had the incident in Delaware where we lost Sergeant Floyd, they killed an officer, a hero. And what happened was the media tried to justify the reasons behind it because there was no program in this facility and all these other things. And it's like, hey, guys, they killed somebody. When is that right? But it didn't matter. So what happened was social media during these times, and sad to say, inmates did have access to cell phones, sad to say, they could read the comments in social media, and there were people supporting them. So now the problem is we have unity and justification. So now you got these inmates, you can't negotiate with them. No matter what I say, it doesn't matter because they're being motivated by the public. And here's another scary thing. The inmates that weren't involved or didn't want to get involved, the moment they started reading those social media outputs, like, yeah, I'm going to get involved. I want to be part of this movement. So again, these social media and public support can really be a threat to the facility because 9 times out of 10, they're supporting the wrong thing. They're supporting something that could be more of a selfish need than it is actually, or selfish want, than it is actual need for the population as a whole. And that kind of deals with how the media generalizes the negative to every facility out there, as opposed to, really holding that facility or that person accountable. So again, guys, social media and public support, very big threat. And then it kind of touches on civil unrest. What happens in the community, guys, trickles into the facility. If the George Floyd, we were easily going to be affected by that. So what do? We made sure we took the temperatures of our facility, making sure that, we wouldn't have any civil unrest that was connected to the community. So be very alert on what's happening in the streets, because what's happening in the streets can easily be trickled down to us for those inmates who want to, again, I say create a message, but in the long run, that's what they're going to claim that they're doing. But how do they create a message? They create it by chaos, in some cases. What's your thoughts on this, Butch?
This could be a whole discussion all on its own. This is a good one. But I read an article this week that could put a bee in my bonnet about the amount of contraband being found in a particular facility or an agency. I think it was a particular facility. And the headlines on the article, I think, were something about since...
Was that the one in Oklahoma in the warehouse?
This was about, I believe it was... for some reason, I'm thinking it was Georgia, but they had suspended visits. They went to...
I read that one.
Video visits. And the author of the article, of course, did some great homework and spoke to inmates and their advocates. Didn't quote any staff members. The representatives... the representative example in which he got his narrative from was from the inmates themselves and the inmate advocates. They didn't speak to any staff. It didn't take the time to investigate other issues. But the basis of the story was that since visits went to video visits, that the amount of contraband in the facility, mainly drugs, had skyrocketed. Of course, the inmates said, well, that's because the staff bring in the majority of the drugs anyway. So it was one-sided, the article. It was clearly biased towards one side. And a lot of people who don't know, rightly so, shouldn't know prison operations. It made a lot of sense to automatically agree with the author saying, well, if visits can't bring it in, and the only other people coming in are staff, it makes sense. But, they left out all the other alternatives of all the other alternative methods to get drugs inside the facility, whether it's through mail, whether it's through inmates coming back from minimum security work details, whether it's been dropped off to a drone, whether it's been you went out to court and came back all loaded up with drugs. These are all methods that inmates use to get the stuff inside. But and don't get me wrong, staff, employees are a method that inmates use and staff use to get drugs inside the facility. So I'm not eliminating them either. And they also, the rationale that they were trying to use, I contradict that as well. The inmates knew that visits were going away. Like you said, they probably implemented it well in advance and told folks. And they took the opportunity to get more drugs in because they knew that avenue was going to dry up. And also, they never gave anyone credit for maybe the staff worked harder and found more drugs. the correction officers may have worked harder, got more information, and discovered more contraband in the facility over the time period in which it was measured. But they never gave any of those other alternative methods. They never gave any credit to the staff for finding more drugs. They immediately focused on, well, if it's not the inmate visitors, it's got to be the employees. And it was really tainted towards the correction officers because also people forget there's doctors in hospitals, nurses in dentist's office, in the real world, out in the community, who are stealing drugs and doing diversion with Oxycontin and all kinds of methadone and all kinds of drugs, a drug of choice of people in prison. So prisons aren't any different than the community, really, when it comes to that different type of stuff. We have school teachers in our schools teaching our children that have issues with breaking the law or not being law abiding. And we have those same issues in prison. So the one-sided reporting is really frustrating to me. And it does nothing to help. In fact, my answer to that is a strict, well-maintained and well-managed, vigorous search program for the facility. And the same people that complained about staff of bringing in the drugs are the same people that criticized us over how strict our search program was at the facility.
Well, one thing real quick is, I love what you said, because if you have staff that's bringing in drugs or bringing in contraband, now not to minimize them, not to minimize their accountability and responsibility, I want to hear something though, is you can't remove the inmate from that, because most likely they're under the control of the inmate at that point. Now, again, they should be held to the fullest responsibility as well. But, again, when people are like, oh, it's staff bringing it in. Yeah, but who are they under control of, sad to say? So that's no longer staff, by the way. They no longer work for us. So stop calling them staff. They work for the inmate. When they work for us, it's staff, yes. But the only time they work for us is when they're doing the right thing. When they decide to bring in drugs and everything else, they no longer work for us. They're the fucking inmates porter, technically. So at that point there, it's like staff's bringing it, yeah, but they're not staff no more, because they're not working for us anymore. They broke the rule. And the other thing is, when you implement a policy, like let's say this visit policy, it makes sense for a lot of stuff to be found at that moment, because you want to put the jail or the prison on a reset. So we're going to implement this policy about, let's say, no visits, and we want to make sure that this could be a concern. Maybe this could alleviate contraband. So what do we want to do? Let's start this facility off fresh. Let's get a lot of search teams in. Let's clean this whole facility out so we can make sure that there's stuff here. We get it out now. And then once they get it out, they try it, and then they can see if it really works. So again, you have to put the facility at reset when you're going to do something like that, to see if something's really working. So if you don't make an effort to do a crazy search beforehand to find all the drugs, whatever it is, then how do you know what you're finding later, if there is anything, really is a benefit from the program that we're trying to do or trying to implement, or, if it's staff, you don't know. So again, I like what you said. You have to try to reset it.
It's too bad the author of that article isn't listening.
Hopefully
he left so much, he or she left so much out, didn't really realize, again, he's trying to sell a newspaper, I guess.
That's all it is. That's all they care about.
But the facts, remain that there's a lot of different variables that went into why we found more drugs at that prison at a certain time.
And it's sad is because when they write it, they want to go by why do they think that most people want to read it? Well, usually most people want to read it because they want to find a way to bastardize the system. So let's write something that continues that narrative. Hey, James, you have anything you'd like to say in closing?
No, sir. I think that this topic is extremely important. I think it goes with mission critical, because these are the things that that relate directly to staff and inmate safety. Also relates to public safety, and it also relates to the resources in which we have. And I will tell you this: when we have riots, it's very, very expensive and very, very difficult on staff morale and the agency trying to recover from riots. And the final thing I want to say is, if you have a good security program in place, you will never 100% prevent these things from happening. But when they do, the damage is far less than if your facility is mismanaged and you don't have those security programs in place, like key control and tool control. If they're using hammers and saws and knives and from the kitchen and all these screwdrivers, and you're not controlling your tools, but they're using those in the riot as compared to makeshift type of stuff, the fire safety, your inmates are going to light fires, and that's always going to happen. But if you have those things and you test them and you manage those things, and you're doing your job, the outcome is going to be far less of severity. So we're never going to eliminate these things, but we have to work to minimize them and to mitigate the results.
Yeah, and guys, just in my closing, I mean, guys, we're looking at things that are trending, making sure that we hold people accountable, make sure that the inmates know that we are taking their concerns seriously if the concern is legit. And I still want to comment on the riot thing. I mean, you're right. I mean, some of these things could be preventive, but most of the time it's going to happen. Why? Human error. We're human. You know, we either get complacent or, you know, neglectful, whatever it is, or over trustworthy. I mean, the point is we're not perfect. So therefore we can't guarantee a perfect system. You know, if that makes any sense. You can't guarantee a perfect criminal justice system because humans are the ones that are running it. Humans are the ones that are working it. So having said that, all we can do is have those fail safes in play. It's not like, hey, I can stop it from happening, but maybe I can stop it from getting worse. I mean, that's the key. I mean, we're going to put 100% effort in preventive measures, but, you know, you can't prevent everything. But I do think, though, when prevention fails, you can give 150% effort into reactionary measures. And that kind of deals with the what if scenarios. Because believe it or not, what if scenarios are really truly based on reaction. You know, what would I do if this? What would I do if this? What would I do if this? So being ready for the what if, like, oh, that will never happen. You don't know. So because you don't know, what if it did? You know, that's the key. As always, guys, the show is tiered up. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post up a video. Stay safe.